Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're doing a deep dive into, well, a really iconic figure, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Everyone knows the name, the face, the D-Day hero.
Exactly. And, for so many people, he's just Unk, right?
Yeah.
That sort of genial, grandfatherly president. But beneath that smile, was there maybe something more, a deeper, more strategic mind, maybe fighting battles we didn't always see?
That's the question, isn't it? Was he just reacting or actively shaping events behind the scenes?
That's what we're digging into.
And we've got some great material here, stuff from the White House Historical Association, Wikipedia, other insights you shared. It's quite a pile.
Yeah, and the mission really is to sift through it all, find those key nuggets, those insights that help us understand the whole person. Not just the general, but the president navigating, the really tricky start of the Cold War.
That's a big story. From Normandy, the Oval Office, all the way back to Kansas, actually. Humble beginnings.
Very humble. He was born David Dwight Eisenhower, actually, October 14th, 1890, down in Denison, Texas.
Wait, David Dwight, not Dwight David.
Yeah, he switched them around as a kid. Apparently, he just liked it better. Anyway, third of 7 sons. Imagine that.
7 boys, wow.
And they moved a bit, but landed in Abilene, Kansas. That's the place he always called home.
So what was life like there? Just a typical kid?
Pretty much, yeah. Good student, loved sports, especially football. Apparently, he was pretty tough. But there's also this really sad story about his younger brother, Earl.
Oh.
Yeah, there was an accident, and Earl lost an eye. The sources say it really haunted Eisenhower his whole life, this feeling of remorse. But he also loved being outdoors, learned hunting and fishing from a local guy.
Okay, but the military interest,
Yeah.
where did that come from? Especially if he had this kind of typical Midwestern upbringing, you wouldn't necessarily expect it.
Well, this is one of those great historical curveballs. It wasn't his dad or anyone like that. It was his mother. His mother, Ida. And get this, she was a pacifist, deeply religious, strongly against war.
Seriously, a pacifist mother sparks a future 5-star general's interest in war.
Kind of ironic, isn't it? But she had this big collection of history books, and that's what grabbed young Dwight's attention. He just devoured them, especially anything about military campaigns, strategy. Became a real history buff. Oh, and apparently he was good at arithmetic and spelling too. Practical skills.
So the spark was there, thanks to Mom's library.
Yeah.
How did he actually end up in the military then?
It was sort of accidental, almost.
Yeah.
A friend was prepping for the Naval Academy exams. Eisenhower thought, hey, maybe I should try that. But instead of Annapolis, he aimed for West Point, got the appointment, started in 1911.
And graduated in that famous class in 1915, right? The class the stars fell on.
That's the one. And life changed pretty quickly after that, personally speaking.
Right. He met Mamie.
Yep. Stationed down at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, met Mamie Geneva Dowd, who was visiting family from Iowa. They hit it off fast.
Really fast.
Oh, yeah. He proposed on Valentine's Day, 1916. They got married that July in Denver. And then began the classic Army life, moving constantly. Something like 35 years of moving from post to post.
That must have been tough. And they faced a real tragedy early on.
They did. Their first son, Dowd Dwight, they called him Icky. He was born in 1917. But then in 1921, he died. Scarlet fever. He was only 3.
Oh, that's heartbreaking.
Just devastating for both of them. The sources really emphasize this was a wound that never, ever healed for Eisenhower. He just couldn't talk about it, even years later. A really deep, private grief.
You can understand that.
Yeah.
But they did have another son later.
Yes. John Sheldon Dowd Eisenhower, born in 1922. He followed his dad into the Army, had a great career himself, retired as a brigadier general, became an author, an ambassador too.
And Camp David connection comes from him, right?
Exactly. John's son was named David, and in 1953, Eisenhower renamed the presidential retreat, which used to be called Shangri-La, Camp David, in his grandson's honor. Nice little family touch.
Okay, so let's pivot to that military career building up before World War II. After West Point, it wasn't exactly high-profile assignments at first.
Not at all. Standard stuff, really. Logistics, infantry posts in Texas, Georgia. World War I breaks out. He's eager to go overseas, get into the fight like everyone else.
But he didn't get to go.
Nope. Kept getting denied. Sent to Fort Leavenworth for more training instead. You can imagine the frustration, right? Seeing your classmates heading off to France.
Definitely.
Well,
So what did he do instead?
sometimes not getting what you want works out. In 1918, he got transferred to Camp Meade in Maryland, joined the brand new Tank Corps. Still thought he might get to France, but nope. Instead, orders came through to command Camp Colt.
Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, his first command.
This first command, yeah. And it was training these new tank crews. Huge responsibility. He got a temporary promotion to lieutenant colonel. And even though he wasn't seeing combat himself, this was where he really started to shine.
How so?
The sources stress his organizational skills were just top-notch. And he had this knack, this real talent for figuring out his junior officers who was good at what, where to put them so they'd succeed, that ability to manage people and systems. It was forged right there at Camp Colt, became his trademark later.
So, invaluable experience, even if it wasn't combat. What happened after the war ended? Demotions were common then.
Oh, yeah. His rank dropped back down to captain and quickly back up to major a few days later. But then he stayed a major for 16 years.
16 years. Wow.
Yeah, the roaring 20s and early 30s were tough for the military. Budgets slashed, promotions frozen. A lot of his friends actually left the Army for business jobs, better prospects.
But during that long stretch as a major, there's that fascinating story about the convoy. The one that connected to the highways later.
Oh, yeah, the 1919 transcontinental convoy. It's such a great piece of foreshadowing. He was assigned to this Army experiment, basically driving military vehicles from D.C. to San Francisco.
What was the point?
Officially test the vehicles, but unofficially, and just as importantly, it was to show everyone how bad the roads were. And they were bad.
How bad?
Average speed, about 5 miles per hour. Think about that. Mud, breakdowns, terrible surfaces. That whole grueling trip just burned into his memory the desperate need for a decent national road system. You can draw a straight line from that 1919 slog to him championing the interstate highway system as president decades later.
That's incredible. Personal experience driving major policy.
Yeah.
And during these interwar years, he wasn't just stuck as a major. He was also learning from some really impressive figures.
Absolutely critical period for his development. He served under some giants, Fox Connor, John J. Pershing, Douglas MacArthur, George Marshall. Imagine that lineup of mentors.
Let's talk about Fox Connor. He seems particularly important.
Hugely influential. Eisenhower was Connor's executive officer down in the Panama Canal Zone from 1920 to 24. Connor basically took him under his wing. It was like getting a PhD in military strategy. Connor directed his reading, made him study Clausewitz's on war, military history, theory. Eisenhower himself said later that Connor taught him so much about how to handle the big personalities he'd face in World War II. He called Connor the ablest man I ever knew. And Connor saw Ike's potential early on, called him one of the most capable, efficient, and loyal officers I have ever met. High praise.
That's a serious endorsement. Did he continue his formal military education?
He did, partly on Connor's advice, went to the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, and this is telling. He graduated first in his class of 245 officers in 1926.
First, out of nearly 250, while still a major.
Yep, shows you the kind of brainpower he had. Then he went on to the Army War College, graduated in 28. He was clearly building the intellectual toolkit for high command.
And then came the Philippines under Douglas MacArthur. That sounds challenging.
Definitely a formative experience. He was MacArthur's chief military assistant from 35 to 39, helping build up the Philippine Army. And yeah, MacArthur was brilliant, but notoriously difficult, demanding.
So, good practice for dealing with difficult allies later.
Exactly. Historians point to this period as crucial preparation for managing the egos of people like Churchill, Patton, Montgomery, even Marshall during World War II. Ike learned how to navigate those tricky interpersonal dynamics, how to work with powerful, sometimes prickly personalities. He later downplayed the clashes with MacArthur, said it was mostly professional disagreement.
Seems like his style: avoid public fights, find a way to work together. Anything else notable from the Philippines posting?
Well, Mimi got very seriously ill there, a stomach ailment, but thankfully she recovered fully. Career-wise, Ike finally got his permanent promotion to lieutenant colonel in 36. And here's a fun fact. He learned to fly, got his private pilot's license in 1939.
Like the pilot, I had no idea.
Yeah. And another little what if, the Philippine government, apparently on MacArthur's recommendation, offered him the job of police chief for their new capital city, Quezon City.
Wow. Police Chief Eisenhower.
He turned it down, obviously, stuck to the military path, which was about to lead him straight into the biggest conflict in history.
World War II. And his rise was incredibly fast once the U.S. got involved.
Meteoric is the word. After Pearl Harbor, General George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, knew exactly who he needed. Marshall valued Ike's planning skills, his strategic mind, his ability to get people working together.
Yeah.
He called Eisenhower to Washington immediately to work on war plans. That trust from Marshall basically launched him.
And his first big commands were in the Mediterranean, North Africa, then Italy.
That's right. He commanded Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa in late 42, then the invasion of Italy. These weren't just military challenges, they were hugely complex politically, especially North Africa.
Dealing with the different French factions there.
Exactly. Vichy, France, Free French. It was a mess. And that's where he made that really controversial call to work temporarily with Admiral Francois Darlan.
Darlan had been a major figure in the Vichy government, which collaborated with the Nazis.
He had. So working with him, even briefly, to secure the landings and minimize Allied casualties, while it caused uproar back home, Allied leaders were reportedly thunderstruck, but, Ike argued it was militarily necessary, and nobody had given him clear guidance on how to handle the Vichy situation beforehand.
A classic example of the messy reality of war and politics colliding.
Absolutely. Darlan was assassinated not long after, and Eisenhower appointed General Giraud. But those early campaigns really threw him into the deep end of coalition warfare, managing allies, making tough political calls under pressure.
While setting the stage for the role he's most famous for. Supreme Commander for D-Day.
Operation Overlords. The Normandy landings, June 6, 1944. It's almost impossible to grasp the scale, the risk involved in that.
And he was the one ultimately responsible.
Totally. As Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, the buck stopped with him. D-Day was brutal, costly, touch and go for a while, but ultimately it worked. It guided that vital foothold in France needed to defeat Nazi Germany.
And a huge part of that success was him managing all those powerful, often clashing personalities on the Allied side.
This is where all that earlier experience paid off, right? Dealing with MacArthur, learning from Fox Connor, he had to wrangle Roosevelt, Churchill, de Gaulle, Montgomery, Patton, not to mention internal battles like with Admiral King over landing craft.
The arguments with Churchill sound intense.
Oh, they were. Eisenhower had to fight hard to get unified command of the air forces for overlords, even threatened to resign. They argued fiercely over the pre-invasion bombing plan in France, too. Churchill was deeply worried about French civilian deaths.
But Eisenhower's plan won out.
It did, and interestingly, de Gaulle apparently backed Eisenhower, arguing the French people would accept the sacrifices needed for liberation.
And then there was Patton. Brilliant general, but
a huge headache for Eisenhower. Ike needed Patton's drive on the battlefield, but he had to constantly rein him in, discipline him for things like slapping soldiers or making outrageous political comments. It was a constant balancing act, use the talent, manage the disruption.
Amid all that high-level stress, the sources mention he made a real effort to connect with the troops before D-Day.
That's really important, I think. It shows the human side of his leadership. Before the invasion, he went out and visited division after division, walked among the paratroopers, the infantry guys who were about to jump into hell. It wasn't just a photo op. You get the sense he felt this crushing weight of responsibility for every single life.
And that famous note he wrote in case the invasion failed.
Oh, yeah. That handwritten note he kept in his wallet. Just a few lines, taking full, sole responsibility if D-Day was a disaster. The troops did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. It's incredibly powerful. Speaks volumes about his character, his sense of duty.
His success led to the 5-star rank.
Yep, promoted to General of the Army in December 1944. Recognition of his supreme command role.
And it's striking, isn't it? He achieved this pinnacle of military leadership, managed all these complex operations and difficult people without having actually commanded troops in combat himself during the war.
His genius was at a different level. It was strategic, leadership, organization, diplomacy. Holding that incredibly fractious Allied coalition together, dealing with Churchill, Montgomery, de Gaulle, keeping them focused on the goal despite disagreements. That was his unique contribution. And apparently he got along well with the Soviet Marshal Zhukov, too, which is interesting given what came later.
He also showed incredible foresight about documenting the Holocaust.
Yes. As the camps were liberated, he immediately understood the horror and the danger that people might try to deny it later. He demanded extensive photo and film documentation. He wanted undeniable proof for history, a really crucial, morally driven decision.
So the war ends. How does this celebrated general transition? It wasn't straight to the White House?
No, not immediately. First, he was military governor of the U.S. occupation zone in Germany for several months in 45, then back to Washington as Army Chief of Staff from 45 to 48.
But the presidential buzz started early, didn't it? Even during the war.
Oh, yeah. As early as 1943, politicians were eyeing his immense popularity. But Eisenhower pushed back hard. He genuinely seemed to believe soldiers shouldn't be politicians. famously said he wouldn't take any political job from dog catcher to Grand High Supreme King of the Universe.
Even Truman tried to recruit him.
Twice. Truman offered to help him win the presidency in 48. Then later, in 47, Truman apparently told him if MacArthur got the Republican nomination, he, Truman, would happily run as Ike's vice president on the Democratic ticket.
Wow. And Ike said no both times.
Yep, declined them flat out.
So instead of politics, he takes this unexpected turn into academia. President, Columbia University.
Right, in 1948. By most accounts, it wasn't a perfect marriage. Ike wasn't a natural academic administrator, and Columbia wasn't quite ready for a five-star general. But he did make his mark. He was genuinely puzzled why there wasn't more academic study on why wars happen, so he pushed hard to create the Institute of War and Peace Studies there. His goal was to study war as a tragic social phenomenon, understand its roots. He leveraged his connections, got funding from wealthy pals. He felt that was a really important contribution.
And he wrote his memoirs around this time, too.
Crusade in Europe, yeah. Huge bestseller in 1948, made him financially secure. There was some controversy, though, about how the payment for the book was taxed.
Ooh, what was that about?
The Treasury Department ruled that his huge advance, something like $635,000, wasn't regular income, but payment for selling the asset of his life story. So he paid much lower capital gains tax instead of income tax. Saved him a fortune, like $400,000, but it definitely raised some eyebrows.
Interesting wrinkle. So Columbia marks his shift to civilian life, but then the military calls again. NATO.
Yep. In 1951, he takes leave from Columbia, puts the uniform back on to become the very first Supreme Allied Commander Europe, commanding the new NATO forces. He was apparently very persuasive in selling the importance of NATO to Congress. Then, in June 1952, he finally retired from active duty for good.
For good this time. Or?
Well, retirement lasted, a few months? Because the pressure to run for president in 52 just became overwhelming.
From the Republicans.
Yes, particularly the more internationalist wing of the party. They were really worried about Senator Robert A. Taft, who was more isolationist, getting the nomination. They saw Ike as the only one popular enough to beat Taft and then win the general election. They sent emissaries over to his NATO headquarters near Paris, basically begging him to run.
And this time, he said yes, leading to the I Like Ike campaign.
Exactly. It was just an unstoppable slogan tapping into that immense public trust and affection. He crushed Adlai Stevenson in the 52 election. He insisted on campaigning everywhere, even the South, which Republicans usually skipped then. His K1C2 strategy hit Truman on Korea, communism, and corruption.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing during the campaign, right? Couple of controversies.
Two big ones. First was the Nixon Fund issue. Accusations flew that Nixon, his running mate, had this secret slush fund. Nixon gave his famous checkers speech on TV to save himself.
Going after the family dog.
That's the one. It worked, kept him on the ticket. But the sources say Eisenhower was deeply unhappy about it, even considered dropping him. And apparently it created this lasting chill between Ike and Nixon.
And the other controversy involved McCarthy.
Yeah, this was tricky. Campaigning in Wisconsin, McCarthy's home turf, Ike gave a speech denouncing wickedness in government. He didn't name McCarthy directly, but everyone knew who he meant. And significantly, the sources connect this to the ongoing Lavender Scare, the purge of suspected gay employees, often conflated with communists. It was Ike's way of condemning the climate McCarthy fostered without picking a direct fight he might not win.
A calculated move. He won big in 52 and then again in 56.
Another landslide against Stevenson in 56. And by then, it wasn't just the war hero image. People genuinely responded to his personal qualities that perceived integrity, sincerity, sense of duty, the family man image, his quiet faith. He just seemed reliable, likable.
So January 1953, he's sworn in. What was the handover from Truman like, given the campaign bitterness?
Apparently pretty frosty and minimal. The sources say they were quite estranged by then.
And his cabinet. That got some interesting descriptions.
Famously dubbed 8 millionaires and a plumber by a reporter. He delegated a lot of the selection to guys like Herbert Brownell and Lucius Clay, ended up with a lot of business execs, plus Martin Durkin from the Plumbers Union as Secretary of Labor. Not many personal friends or DC insiders.
Was that a weakness?
Some critics thought so later, but he did build strong relationships with key figures like John Foster Dulles at State and George Humphrey at Treasury. And a big structural change. He really beefed up the National Security Council, made it central to Cold War policy.
What were his immediate goals coming into office?
He actually held a meeting before inauguration out at Pearl Harbor to set the agenda. Top priorities: balance a budget, End the Korean War, rely more on nuclear deterrence to defend U.S. interests more cheaply. That became the new look defense policy, and get rid of wartime price controls. Foreign policy, especially dealing with the Soviets, was front and center from day one.
And he changed how presidents dealt with the press.
Big time. He held way more press conferences than previous presidents, almost 200. Saw them as a way to talk directly to the American people.
Let's talk about his domestic approach. Dynamic conservatism, or the middle way. What did that really look like?
Basically pragmatic moderation. He wasn't trying to roll back the New Deal or the Fair Deal. He accepted that the federal government had a role in things like Social Security.
So he didn't dismantle those programs.
Quite the opposite. He continued most of them, even expanded Social Security. He created the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, HUW, a big signal about government's role. The conservative part was about managing these programs efficiently, balancing the budget. It was about finding that middle ground, avoiding extremes.
What about civil rights? He talked about ending segregation.
He did, right in his first State of the Union.
Yeah.
And he took concrete steps, especially using federal power in areas the government controlled, like the military. Truman started military desegregation, but Ike really pushed it forward, using government spending as leverage.
There's that story about the Navy.
Yeah, when the Secretary of the Navy apparently tried to argue about respecting local customs regarding segregation, Ike supposedly shot back, "We have not taken, and we shall not take a single backward step. There must be no second-class citizens in this country." Pretty firm stance.
And then, of course, Little Rock.
The big one. Sending the 101st Airborne into Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957 to enforce the Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education decision and ensure those black students could safely attend Central Highs. A hugely symbolic and important act.
But the sources add a crucial nuance there, right?
Yes, and it's important. While he acted decisively to uphold the law, the court order, he consistently resisted calls from civil rights leaders to publicly endorse the Brown decision itself, to speak out on the moral imperative of desegregation. His focus seemed to be more on federal authority and order than on championing the cause wholeheartedly. It shows the complexity of his position.
A distinction with a real difference.
Yeah.
And tied into the anxieties of that era was the Lavender Scare.
A really unfortunate part of the time. His administration issued Executive Order 10450 in 1953. It basically added sexual perversion, meaning homosexuality, to the list of things that could get you fired from a federal job or lose your security clearance.
And this is directly linked to McCarthyism.
Very much so. The fear was rampant. Homosexuality was seen by many as a character weakness, making people susceptible to blackmail and somehow linked to communist sympathies. It was irrational fear, but it led to thousands losing their jobs. The sources note more people were fired for suspected homosexuality than for suspected communist ties during that period. A real tragedy.
How did he manage Congress? He didn't always have a Republican majority.
Only for the first 2 years. Senator Robert Taft was a key ally initially, bridging the gap to the conservatives, but Taft died just months into Ike's first term, which was a blow. He didn't get along great with Taft's successor, William Nolan. But after the Democrats took control in '54, he actually worked pretty effectively with the Democratic leadership, Lyndon Johnson in the Senate, Sam Rayburn in the House. He could find common ground.
Did he have strong political advisors?
Some sources criticize that he maybe lacked really skilled political operators on his immediate staff, though figures like the RNC chairman Leonard Hall tried to keep him connected. Still, he wasn't afraid to use his power. He vetoed 181 bills.
181?
Wow. Yeah, and Congress only overrode 2 of them, so he definitely stood his ground when he needed to.
What about McCarthy himself and the Oppenheimer case? Now, you mentioned the campaign jab, but how did he handle McCarthy once in office?
Mostly by trying to ignore him, avoid direct confrontation. Part of the calculation, the sources suggest, was not wanting McCarthy messing with the Atomic Energy Commission and the H-bomb program, keep the vital defense work insulated from the political circus.
And the Oppenheimer case, that was controversial.
Hugely. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, faced accusations about past associations and his enthusiasm, or lack thereof, for the H-bomb. Eisenhower ordered a blank wall put between Oppenheimer and classified information, essentially stripping his security clearance, even though Ike apparently didn't personally believe Oppenheimer was disloyal.
Why did that reflect badly on Eisenhower?
Critics felt he relied too heavily on advice from people like AEC Chairman Lewis Strauss, who had personal animosity towards Oppenheimer rather than digging into it himself. The hearing that followed ruined Oppenheimer's public career. And Strauss's role in it came back to bite him later when the Senate rejected his nomination for Commerce Secretary.
He also fought off attempts to limit presidential power, like the Bricker Amendment.
Yes, he saw the Bricker Amendment, which aimed to curb treaty powers, as a dangerous overreach by Congress into foreign policy, and he defeated it. On the flip side, he pushed through the Atomic Energy Act of 1954, which allowed private companies to get into nuclear power development.
And his Supreme Court picks had a lasting impact.
Absolutely. 5 appointments. Earl Warren as Chief Justice, a political choice based on integrity, not judicial experience. John Marshall Harlan II. William Brennan, a Democrat who became a liberal icon. Charles Whitaker, who really struggled and retired early. And Potter Stewart, a real mix of philosophies that shaped the court for decades.
Plus, 2 new stars on the flag.
Right. Alaska in January 59, Hawaii in August 59. The 49th and 50th states.
Okay, let's shift fully into foreign policy now. The Cold War really defined his presidency. His goal was reducing tension, but from strength.
That's the new look in a nutshell. Maintain military superiority, especially with nuclear weapons, as a deterrent. The idea was this would let the U.S. cut back on expensive conventional forces, less boots on the ground, save money, but still keep the Soviets in check.
And the first big test was ending the Korean War.
He moved fast on that. Went to Korea right after being elected, saw the stalemate. The Chinese had built up forces, and Ike seriously considered using tactical nuclear weapons if they didn't agree to an armistice quickly.
Did they know he was considering nukes?
It's debated how explicit the threat was or if it was communicated directly. But the Chinese certainly knew who Eisenhower was, the general who beat Hitler. His military reputation carried weight. Plus, Stalin died in March 53.
That must have changed the dynamic.
Big time. Weakened Soviet backing for China's hardline. China finally compromised on the prisoner repatriation issue, the main sticking point. The armistice was signed July 53, ended the fighting, though technically the war never officially ended. That armistice is still what's in place today.
He talked about liberation during the campaign, not just containment.
That was the rhetoric, yeah. Rolling back communism. The Korean armistice didn't exactly achieve liberation for the North, obviously, and while liberation might have been his preference, the reality of the Cold War, especially with nuclear weapons involved, meant containment was often the more practical, less catastrophic approach.
He kept a very tough line on China throughout his terms.
Very tough. Didn't recognize the People's Republic, supported Taiwan as the real China, actively tried to split Beijing from Moscow. This led to those crises over the little islands in the Taiwan Strait, Quemoy and Matsu, when the PRC started shelling them in 54.
How did he handle that?
Forcefully. Sign a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan. Got Congress to pass the Formosa Resolution, basically giving him a blank check to use military force to defend Taiwan. Sent a very clear message.
And nukes were part of that message, too.
Again, yes. During that first Taiwan Strait crisis, he authorized making nuclear threats against mainland China. The sources say this is likely what pushed Mao Zedong to start China's own nuclear program. By rattling the nuclear saber, conducting tests like Operation Teapot, keeping them guessing, Ike basically got what he wanted. The shelling stopped, the island stayed with Taiwan, no wider war. But the U.S. ban on travel to China continued, drawing criticism.
Beyond the military threats, there were covert actions, too.
Definitely. His administration greenlit CIA operations to overthrow governments seen as unfriendly or potentially pro-Soviet. The big ones mentioned are Iran in 1953 getting rid of Mossadegh, bringing back the Shah, securing oil interests, and Guatemala in 1954.
What about Vietnam? The seeds of that conflict were sown during his time.
They were. Early on, 53, the French asked for U.S. military help against the Viet Minh. Ike sent General O'Daniel to check it out. But his Army Chief of Staff, Matthew Ridgway, who knew Korea firsthand, warned him off direct intervention.
Why?
Ridgway laid out the staggering number of troops it would take, potentially hundreds of thousands, to win there. And Eisenhower listened. He famously said getting involved would absorb our troops by divisions. Prophetic words.
So, no direct troops, but the U.S. still got involved.
Yeah, just not with combat forces then. His administration poured money and aid into the new state of South Vietnam after the French left. And he was key in setting up SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, meant to contain communism in the region. So a different kind of commitment was made.
Then came the Suez Crisis in '56. Pitted him against Britain and France.
A huge moment. Britain, France, and Israel invade Egypt after Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal. Eisenhower came down hard on his own allies, condemned the invasion, used financial pressure, diplomatic muscle, even sided against them at the UN to force a withdrawal.
That must have strained alliances.
Oh, it did. But it also showed the U.S. acting independently, based on its own interests and principles, even against its closest friends. Nasser actually praised him for it. It's often contrasted with the simultaneous Hungarian uprising. Ike condemned the brutal Soviet crackdown but didn't intervene militarily, showed the limits of U.S. power and the harsh choices of the Cold War.
And the Eisenhower Doctrine followed Suez.
Right. Designed by Dulles in '57, basically said the U.S. would use force to help any Middle Eastern country fight off communist aggression and offered aid, trying to fill the perceived power vacuum and counter Soviet influence after Suez weakened Britain and France there.
Was it used?
Yep. Aid went to Jordan, there were maneuvers against Syria, and most dramatically, in '58, he sent 15,000 Marines and soldiers into Lebanon Operation Blue Bat.
A combat mission.
Framed as peacekeeping, to stabilize the pro-Western government during internal turmoil, prevent a feared pro-Soviet or radical takeover. It worked, things calmed down, and it was seen as a successful show of U.S. resolve that dampened Soviet influence for a while.
Another huge arena of competition.
Yeah.
Space race. Sputnik.
Sputnik, October '57. It shocked the American public, created this huge sense of falling behind the Soviets. But here's the interesting thing the sources point out. Eisenhower and the CIA knew the Soviets were close. Intelligence indicated as early as January '57 they could launch a satellite within a year.
So it wasn't a total surprise technologically?
Yeah.
But the PR impact was massive.
Exactly. Knowing the capability and seeing it happen are two different things. Sputnik was a blow to American prestige. Eisenhower responded seriously, huge funding increases for space exploration, science, education. That led to the National Defense Education Act. He also cleverly used the open skies proposal he'd made earlier to help justify satellite overflights, paving the way for spy satellites. And crucially, he created NASA in '58 as a civilian agency.
He also pushed for peaceful uses of atomic energy.
Atoms for Peace, his big 1953 UN speech, proposed international cooperation on using nuclear fission for energy medicine, led to the International Atomic Energy Agency, and encouraged civilian nuclear power development worldwide, including the '54 Act in the U.S.
And we have to loop back to the interstate highway system again. The Cold War justification was key.
Absolutely. While we remember it for road trips, Eisenhower sold the 1956 Highway Act primarily on national security, essential for moving troops and supplies quickly in an emergency, evacuating cities. That 1919 convoy experience never left him. He saw good roads as vital defense infrastructure.
Okay, now the U-2 incident, May 1960. This really stirs things up.
Big time. A U.S. U-2 spy plane gets shot down deep inside the Soviet Union. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, is captured alive. It blew the lid off this top-secret, high-altitude surveillance program the U.S. had been running for years.
And the initial reaction was denial.
Yeah, the administration put out a cover story, a weather plane gone astray. But then Khrushchev triumphantly produced the wreckage, the photos, and the pilot, forced Eisenhower to admit the truth. Hugely embarrassing, right before a major summit plan with Khrushchev in Paris.
But some sources, particularly the hidden war materials, suggest maybe it wasn't just an embarrassing blunder, that there might have been a strategic element to how Ike handled it.
That's the fascinating controversial interpretation. That maybe the sequence denial, then admission when caught red-handed, wasn't just fumbling, but a calculated way to manage the fallout. Perhaps a way to contain the crisis, even if it meant sacrificing the summit and taking a public hit to avoid an even bigger confrontation. It paints Ike as still playing chess, even in a seemingly bad position.
A strategic mind working even when things looked chaotic.
It fits that narrative, yeah. Whether intentional or not, the result was clear. The Paris summit collapsed, Khrushchev stormed out, Cold War tensions shot right back up, a really sour end to his efforts at détente.
And one last foreign policy note, the Bay of Pigs.
The initial planning for that CIA-backed invasion of Cuba to oust Castro happened under Eisenhower. He approved the concept, but he was out of office before it launched. It fell to Kennedy to actually carry it out, with disastrous results.
Leading through all this war, Cold War, domestic issues, it must have taken a physical toll. He had serious health problems in office.
He really did. He'd been a heavy smoker for years, chain smoking. Reportedly, though, he supposedly quit cold turkey in 1949. But the damage might have been done.
The heart attack was the big one.
September 1955, while vacationing in Denver. A major heart attack. Hospitalized for 6 weeks. Real questions about whether he could even continue as president. Nixon, Dulles, Sherman Adams kind of ran things administratively while he recovered. His doctor, Paul Dudley White, gave these regular detailed public updates, which was new.
And incredibly, his own doctor thought running again might be good for him.
Yeah, Major General Snyder apparently argued a second term would provide routine, purpose, aid his recovery. Quite a take.
He had other scares, too.
Yes. The heart attack left him with an aneurysm, which likely caused a mild stroke in November 57 during a cabinet meeting. He couldn't speak clearly or move his right hand for a bit, and he had Crohn's disease, needed emergency surgery for a bowel obstruction in June 56.
While the Suez Crisis was unfolding.
Right around then, yeah. Recovering from major surgery while dealing with that international firestorm. It's pretty remarkable he maintained that calm public image through it all.
He was the first president affected by term limits.
That's right. The 22nd Amendment, ratified in 51, prevented him from running for a third term. He was also the first ex-president to get the benefits of the former President's Act, pension, staff, Secret Service for life.
And he got drawn into the 1960 election, maybe not in the way he intended.
He strongly endorsed Nixon over Kennedy, told friends he'd do almost anything to keep Kennedy out. But then came that awkward press conference moment.
The infamous, "Give me a week" line.
Exactly. A reporter asked for an example of a major idea Nixon had contributed that Ike had adopted. Eisenhower paused, then joked, "If you give me a week, I might think of one." Meant lightly, maybe. But the Kennedy campaign jumped all over it, used it in ads to imply Nixon was just Ike's shadow, lacked his own ideas. Nixon lost, narrowly.
What a contrast. Ike, the oldest president to date then, followed by Kennedy, the youngest elected president. His farewell address, though, is remembered as one of the greats.
Absolutely iconic. January 17th, 1961. He warned about the long-term struggle of the Cold War, calling the communist ideology global in scope, atheistic in character, ruthless in purpose, and insidious in method. Strong words.
But the most famous part is the warning about
The military-industrial complex. That phrase entered the lexicon. He acknowledged the need for a huge military and a vast arms industry for defense, but he cautioned Americans to guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by this powerful combination. He worried it could endanger democracy.
It wasn't anti-military, but a warning about the system and the need for oversight.
Precisely. He stressed the need for an alert and knowledgeable citizenry to make sure this vast machine served peaceful ends, that security and liberty could both thrive. Coming from a five-star general, that warning carried immense weight. Still resonates today.
What was retirement like for him?
He split his time between the farm near Gettysburg he and Mamie loved and a place in Palm Desert, California. Didn't completely vanish. Stayed involved in Republican politics, supported candidates, addressed the '64 convention, though his endorsement of Goldwater, who'd criticized his administration, seemed a bit lukewarm. He lived to see Nixon finally inaugurated in '69 and praised it.
And he passed away later that year.
March 28, 1969, at Walter Reed. He was 78. Congestive heart failure after several heart attacks in his later years. His reported last words were very moving, very simple.
What were they?
According to his son, John, he said, "I've always loved my wife, my children, and my grandchildren, and I've always loved my country. I want to go. God, take me."
Powerful. He received full state honors.
Yes. Lay in repose at the National Cathedral, then lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda. State funeral attended by Nixon, LBJ, world leaders like de Gaulle. Buried back home in Abilene, Kansas.
So, looking back at this whole incredible life, how do we assess his legacy now? It seems like views have really changed over the decades.
Oh, definitely. A major reassessment. While he was president, his approval ratings were sky high, consistently popular, second highest average ever in Gallup polls. But right after he left office, especially with Kennedy's Camelot taking over, his stock fell among some historians and commentators.
What were the main criticisms then? The do-nothing president label.
Yeah, that was part of it. Seen as inactive, playing too much golf. Specific criticisms included being too cautious on civil rights, not publicly championing the cause enough despite Little Rock. The U-2 incident looked like a clumsy failure. The perception the Soviets were winning the space race and missile race, and his refusal to directly fight McCarthy, even while despising his methods.
But then the archives opened up.
Exactly. Once historians got into his private papers, the NSC records, the diaries, a very different picture emerged. Much more active, strategic, hands-on, behind the scenes than the public image suggested. The reassessment was dramatic.
And where does he rank now?
Overwhelmingly positive consensus among historians today. Consistently ranked in the top 10 presidents, often in the top tier. People point to ending the Korean War without starting others, managing Cold War crises without global conflict, strengthening NATO, steering the GOP away from isolationism and McCarthyism, presiding over prosperity, balancing budgets, pushing technology, advancing civil rights. even if cautiously, and that incredibly prescient military-industrial complex warning. It's a strong record when viewed through that lens.
And his political style, the middle way, is seen differently too.
Yeah, what once looked like maybe indecisiveness or lack of strong conviction is now often seen as pragmatic, effective leadership. Working with Democrats, not trying to undo the New Deal, it looks like smart politics for the time. Reducing friction, building consensus. Some call him a political genius for making incredibly tough Cold War calls seem calm and routine, keeping the public from panicking. Although conservatives still argue he wasn't conservative enough.
He's certainly well memorialized.
Absolutely. Time Person of the Year back in '44, countless military honors, halls of fame, and just recently Fort Gordon renamed Fort Eisenhower. His mark is indelible.
So, wrapping up this deep dive, we've gone from Kansas to West Point, through the crucible of World War II command, into the Oval Office during the chilliest years of the Cold War. A remarkable journey.
It really is. Soldier to statesman. And that theme of the strategic mind, the careful calculation beneath the calm surface, seems pretty well supported. Whether planning overlords or navigating nuclear brinkmanship, he was always thinking several moves ahead.
And understanding someone like Eisenhower, it really does give us context for today, doesn't it? Seeing how leaders back then dealt with huge global threats, civil rights struggles, the balance of power.
It makes you think about leadership itself. What lessons can we take from his unique path? A career military man becoming president, how does that inform leading through complex threats today? And that